The wilderness stretched endlessly, blanketed in a thick layer of snow. The wind howled through the towering pines, carrying with it an icy chill that bit through even the warmest of layers. This was no place for the faint of heart. Miles away from the nearest town stood a small wooden cabin nestled between the trees, a lone sanctuary in the unforgiving cold. Inside the cabin lived a man, a solitary figure who had chosen this life of isolation. The crackling fire in the hearth provided a fragile barrier against the brutal storm outside. He had grown used to the silence, the kind that pressed in on you, broken only by the occasional howl of a distant wolf. But on this particular morning, something shattered the stillness. Through the frost-covered window, he spotted a dark shape just beyond the porch. Squinting through the glass, he froze. A massive bear, flanked by two small cubs, stood motionless in the snow. The mother's fur was coated with frost, her cubs huddled close for warmth. They didn't move, just stood there as if waiting for something. The man's breath caught in his throat. Why were they there? And what could he possibly do in the face of such an unusual and haunting sight? The man stood by the window, his breath fogging up the cold glass as he watched the trio outside. The bear's massive frame was imposing even in its stillness, her fur crusted with frost, evidence of the brutal storm she had endured. Her cubs, barely the size of large dogs, clung tightly to her sides, their tiny bodies shivering uncontrollably. Every so often, one would lift its head weakly, only to nuzzle closer into its mother's frozen fur. He had seen bears before, usually from a distance, but never like this, never so vulnerable. His chest tightened as conflicting emotions swirled within him. These were wild animals, powerful and unpredictable. Yet there they stood, mere feet away, looking as though they had been pushed to the edge of survival. The man's hand hovered near the door handle, his mind racing. If he stepped outside, would the mother bear see him as a threat? Would she charge, protecting her young, or was she too weak to do anything at all? The thought of those cubs, barely holding on in the freezing cold, tugged at his heartstrings. They needed help, but was it even his place to intervene? He took a step back from the door, his heart pounding. The weight of the decision pressed on him as he glanced between the door and the bears. What if stepping out could make things worse? What if doing nothing meant their end? As the man stood frozen by the window, his mind began to drift. This wasn't the first time he'd faced a decision like this, and the memory clawed its way back, unbidden but vivid. Years ago, before he'd retreated to this cabin, life had been different. He had a family then, a wife and a little girl who adored animals as much as he did. Their weekends were spent hiking, watching deer graze, and marveling at birds soaring through the sky. But one summer afternoon changed everything. A routine camping trip took a tragic turn when his daughter wandered too close to a riverbank. He remembered the chaos, the rushing water, the desperate cries, and the agonizing moments when he realized he couldn't reach her in time. The weight of that loss broke something inside him, and the man who had once cherished the beauty of life withdrew from the world. The cabin became his refuge, a place where he could exist without confronting the ghosts of his past. Over time, he grew wary of getting too close to anything that could be taken from him. Even the animals he occasionally encountered outside the cabin were met with a quiet detachment. It was safer to keep his distance, but now as he looked at the mother bear and her cubs struggling against the unforgiving cold, the old conflict stirred within him. Empathy warred with fear, and for the first time in years, he questioned his resolve to stay detached. Would helping them open old wounds, or bring a measure of healing he didn't know he needed? The man's hand trembled as it hovered over the door latch. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside, to let nature take its course, but the sight of the cubs' frail bodies and the mother's silent desperation gnawed at him. His pulse pounded in his ears as he finally pushed the door open, the frigid wind slicing through the warmth of his cabin like a knife. The sound caught the mother bear's attention. Her head snapped up, and for a moment the man froze, his heart hammering. Her eyes locked onto his, dark and intense, as though she was assessing him. She didn't growl or move toward him, just stared, her body tense but not aggressive. The cubs pressed closer to her, their tiny faces peeking out with timid curiosity. He took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. "It's okay," he murmured softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. The mother bear's ears flicked at the sound, but she remained still. The man felt an unspoken understanding pass between them, a fragile thread of trust that he couldn't explain but dared not break. Keeping his distance, he moved to the side of the cabin where his tools were stored. Grabbing an old tarp, some planks, and a handful of nails, he began to work. His fingers, numb from the cold, fumbled with the tools, but he didn't stop. Piece by piece, he constructed a makeshift shelter a few feet from his porch. He worked quickly, stealing glances at the bear, who watched his every move with wary eyes. When it was done, he stepped back and gestured toward the shelter. "It's not much, but it'll keep the wind off you," he said, though he knew she couldn't understand. To his surprise, the mother bear nudged her cubs forward, and they shuffled into the crude structure. She followed, her massive frame filling the small space as she curled protectively around her babies. The man stood there, his breath visible in the cold air, watching as they settled in. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his heart, something that had long been buried under the weight of loss. Days turned into nights, and the harsh winter showed no mercy. The man kept a careful routine, leaving food at a safe distance from the makeshift shelter and retreating to his cabin to watch from the window. Each time, the mother bear would emerge cautiously, sniffing the air before nudging her cubs toward the food. The cubs, though still weak, eagerly devoured the scraps, their energy slowly returning. At first, he thought the mother bear was simply cautious, letting her cubs eat first as she kept watch. But after a few days, he noticed something troubling. She never ate. Not a single bite. She stood guard, her frost-covered fur barely shifting in the biting wind, while her cubs fed hungrily. Her movements grew slower, her frame thinner. It became painfully clear. She was sacrificing herself to ensure her cubs' survival. The realization hit the man like a punch to the chest. He sat by the window that evening, his thoughts swirling. This mother bear, a creature of raw instinct and survival, was showing a depth of love and selflessness that rivaled any human bond. He couldn't help but think of his own past, of how he had failed to protect the ones he loved most. The guilt, the helplessness, it all came rushing back. But this time, he wasn't helpless. He had a choice. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. If he intervened further, he might put himself in danger or disrupt the fragile balance of nature. But if he did nothing, the mother bear might not survive the winter. Line of the shelter through the frosted window, his breath fogging up the glass. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of responsibility, not just for himself, but for a life he could still save. The question loomed heavy. Should he cross that line and step deeper into a world he had always kept at arm's length? The man sat by the fire that night, the warmth of the flames doing little to thaw the icy tension in his chest. He couldn't shake the image of the mother bear standing sentinel, her strength dwindling as she gave everything to her cubs. Every instinct told him to keep his distance, to let nature take its course, but the thought of those cubs losing their mother and the mother losing her fight was unbearable. The decision came suddenly. He stood, pulling on his thickest coat and boots, and unlatched the cabin door. The bitter cold bit at his skin, but he didn't hesitate. With a deep breath, he swung the door wide open. The glow from the fire spilled out into the darkness, casting long shadows on the snow. He stepped back, keeping his hands visible, and called out softly, "It's warm in here. For you and your cubs." His voice wavered, uncertain if the bear could even comprehend his gesture. The mother bear poked her head out of the shelter, her black eyes gleaming in the firelight. She stood still, watching him with an intensity that made his heart pound. Slowly she turned to her cubs, nudging them forward with her nose. The cubs hesitated, but then took tentative steps toward the open door, their small bodies trembling. The mother bear followed cautiously, her massive frame moving with deliberate care. She paused at the threshold, glancing back at the man. It was a moment of unspoken trust, fragile yet profound. Finally, she stepped inside, guiding her cubs to the corner of the cabin where the fire's warmth reached. The man sat down on the opposite side of the room, his movements slow and non-threatening. He watched as the mother bear curled around her cubs, her eyes still fixed on him. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: connection. The divide between man and beast dissolved in that small cabin, replaced by a quiet understanding. Fear gave way to awe, and isolation melted into a bond that transcended words. As the weeks passed, the once frail cubs grew stronger. Their playful energy filled the cabin while their mother rested, her strength slowly returning. The man maintained a careful distance, providing food and watching quietly as they thrived. The warmth of the fire, the safety of the cabin, it was enough to give them a fighting chance against the unforgiving winter. The snow began to melt, dripping from the trees and uncovering patches of earth. Spring was near. One morning, the mother bear stood by the open door, her cubs at her side. She paused, her dark eyes meeting the man's one final time. It was a moment of silent gratitude, unspoken yet deeply understood. Then, with a gentle nudge, she led her cubs out into the awakening forest. The man stood at the threshold, watching their forms fade into the trees. A pang of sadness gripped him. The cabin felt emptier without them. But alongside the sadness came something unexpected: fulfillment. For the first time in years, he felt he had made a difference, not just for the bears, but for himself. As he closed the door, he glanced around the now quiet space. He thought about what the experience had taught him: the strength of compassion, the importance of coexistence, and the courage it takes to open yourself to the unknown. Sometimes, he realized, opening a door is about more than letting someone in. It's about opening your heart, and in doing so, you might just find yourself saved too.